The rational man's burden. Embracing the dichotomy of human moral architecture. I have dedicated years to waging a futile war against the fundamental architecture of human moral consciousness, railing against existential winds, demanding that reality conform to my conception of decency. I insisted that righteousness should serve as humanity's universal lingua franca, that moral clarity should transcend individual and cultural boundaries. This prolonged struggle has culminated in a stark, liberating, and philosophically grounded realization. Those of rational mind and righteous disposition confront an inescapable ontological truth. We must accept that a significant portion of humanity will perpetually categorize others as subhuman undesirables, regardless of our moral protests or ethical demonstrations. This acceptance represents not cynical capitulation, but profound philosophical awakening. The Stoic embrace of reality as it manifests, not as we wish it to be. The human landscape divides along fundamental fault lines of moral perception. On one terrain stand those who consciously strive toward the good, who navigate by internal moral compasses, who perceive each human being as a vessel containing divine potential. Across the chasm exists a vast, chaotic majority, the assholes, the narcissists, the psychopaths, the sociopaths, and the megalomaniacs, individuals whose external professions of faith, educational credentials, or social standing provide no reliable indication of their internal moral architecture. The sooner I internalize that hypocrisy constitutes not an aberration, but a fundamental feature of human social organization, the more effectively I can navigate this divided landscape. My fundamental error, the catastrophic business miscalculation of my soul, was the psychological mechanism of projection. I assumed my own moral sensibilities represented universal human equipment. Because I experienced guilt as a regulatory emotional response to ethical transgression, I presumed guilt operated similarly within all human consciousness. Because I value truth as an intrinsic good, I assumed truth held equivalent status in every moral hierarchy. This represented profound philosophical naivety, a failure to apply Platonic insights about the nature of human perception. Plato's allegory of the cave illustrates that most humans remain prisoners of shadowy representations, yet I persistently attempted to engage these prisoners as if they were fellow philosophers. I expected those dwelling in moral darkness to perceive the brilliant sunlight of ethical clarity. The asshole consciousness operates on an entirely different frequency, a distinct moral operating system, incompatible protocols, and fundamentally different objectives. This consciousness automatically categorizes itself as belonging to a superior class while relegating others to subordinate status. Within this framework, I represent not a moral equal, but a subhuman undesirable. The rules of ethical engagement cease to be universal principles and become situational tools applied selectively based on categorical distinctions. I previously experienced profound cognitive dissonance when observing contradictory moral behavior. How could individuals profess allegiance to constitutional principles, biblical teachings, or human rights doctrines, while simultaneously participating in the subjugation of native populations, the enslavement of Africans, or the systematic debasement of economically disadvantaged groups? How could moral agents retire each evening as if their daily actions contain no ethical contradictions? The resolution to this apparent paradox lies in understanding their distorted application of Kant's categorical imperative. Kant proposed that ethical action requires acting only according to maxims that could become universal law without contradiction. The asshole consciousness inverts this principle through categorical moral segregation. Their operational maxim becomes, ethical principles apply comprehensively to you, but situationally to me. More precisely, moral law governs interactions within my designated peer group, but becomes irrelevant when dealing with categorized inferiors. Critical understanding emerges from recognizing that most individuals committing ethical violations possess clear understanding of right and wrong distinctions. They experience no moral confusion. They simply maintain distinct moral frameworks for different human categories. Framework A. Within their designated in-groups, country clubs, corporate boardrooms, social cliques, traditional moral commandments retain full force. Theft from peers constitutes violation. Harm or slander against equals represents transgression. Among moral equals, they demonstrate politeness, civility, and social propriety. Framework B. When interacting with categorized, downtrodden misfits, undesirables, or subhumans, these moral constraints evaporate. We become classified as insects inhabiting the Earth's surface. Exterminating insects represents not ethical violation, but necessary sanitation. This dual framework elucidates the cognitively dissonant hypocrisy of the Christian slave trader singing worship hymns on decks above holds, containing dying human cargo. Within his moral architecture, he commits no sin because the cargo falls outside his circle of moral consideration. He can emotionally engage with biblical narratives of Israelite slavery under Pharaoh, while systematically enslaving entire continental populations without ethical discomfort. This represents the fundamental mechanism of institutionalized evil, the cognitive capacity to delineate moral boundaries that declare, within this perimeter resides humanity, beyond lies expendable resource. Jesus Christ, functioning as ultimate philosophical realist, perceived this moral dichotomy with exceptional clarity. His teachings distinguish the narrow path of authentic virtue from the wide path of superficial conformity. For many years, I misinterpreted the wide path as exclusively populated by overt criminals and violent offenders. I fundamentally misjudged its demographic composition. The broad highway leading to existential destruction is actually paved with superficial conformists, ethical performers, moral charlatans, and passive enablers. This thoroughfare crowds with systematic deceivers and psychological manipulators. These individuals master the art of appearance management. Externally, superficially, they present as exemplary, flawless, morally pristine individuals. Their verbal expressions contain elevated moral rhetoric. They occupy positions as community pillars and institutional leaders. Yet in the hidden chambers of their consciousness, they operate as narcissistic, ethically compromised, psychologically predatory entities. Their fundamental orientation seeks not truth but dominance. They will expend significant resources traveling substantial distances, specifically to engage in debate, not for intellectual discovery, but for the psychological debasement of opponents. They derive pleasure from this degradation process. It provides neurochemical reinforcement, fleeting sensations of superiority that their emotionally hollow beings desperately crave. I have discovered through painful experience that you cannot prevail in rational discourse with individuals who experience pleasure from your psychological distress. You cannot employ logical persuasion with those who perceive you as insectoid. Attempting such engagement represents the philosophical equivalent of casting pearls before swine. They will trample the intellectual treasures, then turn violently upon the presenter. The existential improvement materializes when you cease engagement. You terminate efforts to demonstrate your humanity to those whose psychological stability depends upon denying it. This philosophical realization extends to analyzing societal structures and governance systems. I previously maintained the optimistic belief that identifying the optimal political framework, communism, democracy, constitutional republic, would resolve fundamental human moral challenges. I now understand that systemic integrity depends entirely upon the moral character of implementation agents. Virtuous administrators operating within any system will produce beneficial outcomes, but corrupt individuals managing even the most ideally designed system will generate harmful, evil, and systematically corrupt results. Since assholes and megalomaniacs experience magnetic attraction to power centers, comparable to moths drawn to flame, they inevitably infiltrate leadership structures. They aggressively seek priority positioning. They pursue corporate dominance, consumer manipulation, and material accumulation. They strategically employ marginalized populations as psychological scapegoats to facilitate their ascension. Consequently, societies will perpetually contain marginalized, misfit, and undesirable populations. This represents not pessimistic resignation, but stoic recognition of the inherent nature of Augustine's city of man. St. Augustine's theological framework distinguished the city of God from the city of man. We inhabit the city of man, administered by the superficial virtue demographic. Expecting this domain to manifest perfect justice resembles anticipating wolves to adopt vegetarian diets. This philosophical landscape raises the critical question: what represents the appropriate existential position for the rational-minded righteous individual? If we confront no viable alternative except accepting this moral reality, does this lead to despair? Does it necessitate ethical surrender? Absolutely not. We redirect our attention inward. We commence construction of the internal ethical fortress. If the external world teems with asshole consciousness, then my primary ethical obligation becomes resisting transformation into what I oppose. My duty involves maintaining functional moral navigation systems when surrounding consciousness has discarded their ethical instrumentation. My responsibility requires treating the categorized subhuman as fully human, even when this ethical consistency carries social or material costs. My mission becomes walking the narrow path of authentic virtue within civilizations racing along ethical freeways. I now comprehend that my previous anger represented a form of philosophical attachment. I remained emotionally invested in the expectation that reality should conform to my ethical preferences. By relinquishing this demanding expectation, I achieve existential liberation. I can perceive the asshole consciousness for its true nature, a tragic psychological condition, a spiritual pathology, an individual who demonstrates profound laziness. By refusing the demanding work of philosophical development, I can experience compassionate understanding. I can navigate around this consciousness, but I will no longer permit it to fracture my psychological integrity. I embrace the reality of systemic hypocrisy. I accept the existence of categorical double standards. I acknowledge that within certain consciousness frameworks, I may perpetually remain categorized as insectoid, but I maintain clear self knowledge regarding my essential nature. I recognize myself as a manifestation of incorporeal, self transcending, loving divine consciousness. I am an individual who has risked existential security for ethical principles. I possess compassionate understanding. I have cultivated philosophical wisdom. This self knowledge provides sufficient foundation. Let the superficial consciousness traverse their broad highways. Let them accumulate their material vehicles and architectural monuments. They travel comfortably toward existential precipices. I shall navigate my challenging, narrow pathway, accumulating experiential scars and psychological bruises, but maintaining soul integrity, understanding that ultimately the only judgment possessing significance originates from the consciousness that perceives fundamental intention, core motivation, and authentic conviction. Zerga in synthesis with the philosophers.